welcome to wesleygospel.com. I just completed the second chapter of this extremely insightful book by Richard Weiss, The American Myth of Success. Oh, I'm sorry, I completed the third chapter, sorry. Um, Extremely insightful. And basically what we're looking at here is this is a history of economic ethics in the United States. So if we could look at um, a history of economic ethics in the church from the medieval times up through um, the Puritan times. So basically, medieval times, the 1200s to the 1600s, the economic ethics right here, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism by R.H. Tawney. Um, the American Myth of Success is basically a continuation of what R.H. Tawney's talking about. So you could really put these two together and you have a complete story of the history of economic ethics. What is economic ethics? Well, it's business ethics from a biblical point of view. Business ethics from a Christian theology point of view. Um, and so R.H. Tawney starts around the year 1200 and he runs it up through the late 1600s, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. Richard Weiss, The American Myth of Success, starts at the 1600s and he starts in America. So whereas R.H. Tawney is strictly basically in Europe, it kind of ends in New England, Puritan America, up around Boston, I think. Um, but R.H. Tawney is much more European focused. This is strictly American. Starts with the Boston Puritans in the 1600s and pushes you up through the 1700s and 1800s and stuff. So really, it truly is. American Myth of Success by Richard Weiss truly is picking up where R.H. Tawney left off in Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. It is the history of Christian economic ethics. Very profound. And so if you've ever had questions about our society, if you've ever observed around you the economic situation, the way things are, business world, and things just don't add up for you, things just look really screwy, all right? Here's your answers right here. These two books will give you plenty of answers as to why things are the way they are, why they're so screwy, why people act so nasty at business. Why can't people just go and get a job, make money, and go home and have peace? Why does everything have to be so filled with office politics and screwed up behavior? Right? Why is it? Well, it's not because we live in a fallen world. It's because there are ideologies that have come in and that have infiltrated the business world, and there's been pushback against Christian influence. All right. Anyway, um, so starting at page 64, I'm just kind of overview. This chapter was called The Christian Novel and the Success Myth. Now, when you're studying anything by an academic person like this is, when the word myth is being used, it doesn't really mean, like when you think of Greek gods and goddesses, like Greek mythology, it doesn't really mean um, it's not true, it's a fake story, it's a fairy tale. What they mean is that it's a sacred narrative, like it's a hallowed, it's a story, and it's an ideology, and it's a legend that is sacred and um, uh, carried with high amount of reverence, basically. So the idea, we could call it the success ideology or the success philosophy of rags to riches that exists, or the American dream of rags to riches. You start off with nothing and you work your way up and you end up rich. Maybe you even end up as a millionaire later on. This whole idea is central to being an American, the rags to riches idea, the rags to riches theme, if you want to call it that. And so what you have in chapter 3 is basically we're not reading about Horatio Alger stories anymore, like Ragged Dick and Phil the Fiddler and Tom the Bootblack. These were the first success stories that were aimed at kids, at boys, um, in the early 1830s. Horatio Alger Jr. had written all these boys' stories about basically usually about orphans, young orphan males who worked their way up in society. I think in England this took the form of Charles Dickens. Oliver Twist, I don't know everything about Oliver Twist, but I think again he's an orphan and he works his way up or something. Um, Christmas Carol, these are 1800s novels. Christmas Carol is a clear example of one that has stood the test of time. These 1800s Christian novels about business ethics. And then eventually, It's a Wonderful Life, the movie that came out, is kind of like a twist off of or a spin off of Christmas Carol. But you'll oftentimes find these are set in the 1800s and they're set with a hearkening back favorably to the Puritans. So if we could just get back to the way that things were in the Puritan times, when righteousness in business was the focus, when hard work and frugality was the focus, when moderation was the focus, when justice, honesty was the focus in business. And if we could just get back to the way things used to be, then our society wouldn't be so screwed up. You oftentimes find that the Salvation Army will come into these stories, and you can see the Salvation Army even a little bit in some scenes in Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. The Salvation Army was a Methodist holiness denomination, but more so than that, it was a social gospel movement. In other words, it was evangelical, but it was focused on poverty alleviation. And even today, they have thrift stores and they have soup kitchens. They're very focused on the inner city, urban relief of the homeless, and poverty alleviation. So the Salvation Army will sometimes weave its way into these Christian novels. This was an entire genre. In the 1800s, an entire genre of Christian novels developed around this idea of rags to riches, but through the Puritan work ethic. Okay, so taking that old Puritan work ethic from the 1600s and 1700s and weaving them into these fictional novel stories. And oftentimes the rags to riches thing starts out with an orphan. The hero is this orphan, and he works his way up and becomes a millionaire by the end. A millionaire, and he finds himself a woman, and he did it all the right way. And sometimes some people will look at these and say that's unrealistic. That's not really how real life works. But that's not the point. The point is to paint the picture of the way things should be, not necessarily the way things are. And so this caused some tension because on the one hand, the Christian novel writers were painting a picture of the way, if only things could be this way in the business world, everything would be all right. And so to be able to look at Scrooge and say, after he receives his 3 visions and becomes his born-again businessman, they might say, well, that's great for him, but that's just a fictional character. That doesn't happen in real life. Reality is Scrooge would go right back to business and go right back into his old habits of business. And so there became a division in the literary world between people like Charles Dickens, who wrote these Christian stories about success, of doing things the right way in business, and those who continued the pathway of amoral, agnostic pictures of success. And these people were called realists. And they say, no, we want to portray success the real way, the way things really are in the business world. Remember Machiavelli and the Prince? He wasn't about correcting deception and cruelty among the princes. He was just making observations and saying this is how things really are, and you know, uh, so the realists were basically Machiavellian writers, and so they would write success stories that were not with Christian themes at all, and would often have erotic literature mixed in, and basically rakes and loose women and playboys were at the center of these immoral worldly stories, like The Wolf of Wall Street. So you had stuff like The Wolf of Wall Street um, type books coming out in the 1800s as well. And these were in competition with the Christian novels, and so most likely these Christian novels would be comparable to something like Left Behind, but this was not End Times, but probably be more comparable to something like um, Love Speaks Softly, like these Amish romance stories that you see in Christian bookstores with these Amish girls and these headdresses. So, you know, these Christian novels, all right. So, but back in the 1800s, there were romantic elements in these Christian novel stories, but it was really focused on rags to riches. The main character is a boy. It's an orphan. He grows up into a young man. He meets a rich benefactor who pays his way through school, and then but through his hard work, his diligence and frugality, he rises up the ranks and gets promoted and meets a wonderful girl, and they start a family and they live happily ever after. It's sort of a Cinderella theme with Christian principles being mixed in. And so who were the big influencers during this period? Charles Sheldon and E.P. Roe were the two guys. And in terms of standing the test of time, Charles Sheldon's book In His Steps came from this time period, and I've read it. There's a Christian movie that was made of it with black and white, and basically it's evangelical, and the idea of In His Steps was simply let's focus on the poor, let's focus on poverty alleviation, and let's bring our Christian principles into the workplace, even if it costs us our jobs. You know, let's do the right thing no matter what. Um, so in his steps, Charles Sheldon stood the test of time. There was another book written this time period called Barriers Burned Away by E.P. Roe, and uh, and you're dealing with the city, the evil city of Chicago, and this comes up in several of these 1800s, that Chicago is this evil city, or New York is this evil city, and it has many opportunities for business, but it's also filled with religious skeptics. And and if you want to get back to the traditional way of life, you need to maybe take your new wife or your new husband and get back out into the country where you belong. Uh, so you can live by your Christian principles again. Industrial Revolution was not just viewed as now we've got factories, so now we can make things in mass production. It was viewed as having a corrosive moral influence on people's private morals because because people are treated like slaves. It's a Machiavellian institution. You know? I mean, the obviousness of the cruelty of being an assembly line worker and working in a sweatshop, the obviousness of it was plain for everyone to see. That these people were being mistreated, their working conditions were so reprehensible, and it was obvious to large groups of people, and yet on and on they went, unscrupulously making millions off of the backs of their wage slaves. Okay. Uh, so the back to the land element is there. You know, look back, get back out into the country where you belong. Get away from these factories, because they're unhealthy for you. Not only physically unhealthy, but they're unhealthy for your soul. Get out of the factories. Stay away from this newfound corporate America, this industrial revolution. It's not good for you. Um, these rich industrialists were looked upon as either hypocrites or as amoral atheists, and they would just break rules all the time in order to get ahead. And so the Christian person's like, look, I'm not going to compromise my Christian morals in order to get ahead. And if that means that my upward mobility is limited to a certain degree, then so be it. I will try to come up as high as I can, but if I have to lie, cheat, and steal, if I have to cuss, if I have to commit sexual immorality to get promoted even further, I think that's going to be my ceiling. I'm not going to go that far. And so that's basically the morals that are being taught in these stories. Um, and and this is in competition with erotic literature that's coming out, a lot of pornographic erotic literature that was coming out in the 1800s, that people would read the stories, right? And so these Christian bookstores would start and would push these Christian stories. There was this interesting success story, Christian success story. It was called The Eyes of the World by Harold Bell Wright. And the characters in the story were a lot like the characters in Pilgrim's Progress, where they had funny names, like spirit names for their name. Like, for example, the millionaire in the story, his name is Materialism. A young girl who marries a king, her name is the Spirit of Nature. Um, a matron, her name is the Spirit of the Age. A lustful young man, his name is Sensual. And they're all capitalized, right? Just like, the names of the characters in Pilgrim's Progress. So you can see that these people are following in the steps of John Bunyan and these, the Christian novel tradition is what we're looking at here. And that's how they kept the Puritan ethics going. Whereas in former times, it was mainly being communicated through theology books like The Religious Tradesman by Richard Steele. Throughout the 1800s, the theology of economics apparently seemed to kind of drop from the scene, and they continued to communicate those ideas through novel format. I actually just remembered John Bunyan had written in the 1600s a Puritan novel about business ethics. It was called The Life and Death of Mr. Badman. I haven't read it, but the story is that it's like a Wolf of Wall Street expose type story that he had written. So these people were kind of continuing that tradition that he had started a really long time ago, with the sort of Horatio Alger theme of taking that poor orphan and having him climb his way up by faith of God and by following Christian principles. And of course, the non-Christian writers of the day mocked, scoffed, and laughed at these books. They said that they're unrealistic, they have no bearing in reality. Let's be realistic. So these authors were called realists. And they just looked at the Horatio Alger books as their starting point, and they basically continued in a Wolf of Wall Street Machiavellian tradition. So you had these two novel traditions of the success theme. One was Christian and Puritan and held to the principles of diligence, frugality, and honesty in faith and in philanthropy in the business activity, and that was the Christian element. And then there was the Machiavellian or the secular success stories, where people could act like playboys and do all sorts of crimes and get away with it and step all over people and show you how to step all over people and show you how to be a Machiavellian and manipulate people and get ahead and step over people. And these were amoral characters. And so there was God's way to be successful, albeit there was limits on it. And then there was the devil's way to be successful, which was unlimited. It's unlimited. And there was no moral controls whatsoever. So there were, in the 1800s, it seems to be there was a battle in the world of fiction novels over these two pathways to success. There was the old-fashioned Puritan way, which kind of had a very reluctant attitude towards the city and almost absolutely despised factory work and couldn't wait to get back out into the country where they really belonged, out in God's country. And then there was the worldly Machiavellian tales of rags to riches that was more like Wolf of Wall Street and had this playboy sort of attitude, and you can do whatever you want as long as you put your mind to it, and there was no morals on it whatsoever. So that's what was going on throughout the 1800s, and but it seems that throughout the 1800s, I can't tell which one was more popular. I really can't. He didn't really make that very clear. But it seems to me, if I was to be perfectly honest, probably the secular books were more popular. I would think. But who's to say? Who's to say? Maybe at this stage in history, the Christian books were more popular. But there was clearly a struggle, a tug of war going on in the realm of literature, in the realm of literature. And I just remembered also in girls' literature, Little House on the Prairie books and Anne of Green Gables books were also 1800s books that fell into this category of, you got Anne of Green Gables, she's this orphan, right? Little House, there's a super poor family living in poverty. And eventually, as time progresses in these stories, they become wealthy and they become established. I just forgot. So there's yet again more examples of the 1800s success stories, sometimes based in real life. Like Little House was actually based autobiographical, but most of them were fictional stories in order to teach lessons, to not give up, to not accept things the way they are, to improve things, but by sheer determination, perseverance, and grit, by hard work, and by being frugal with your earnings. And but there was a Christian path to that, and that sometimes that was limited. It was a no compromise approach to ethics, and sometimes you said, well, I guess I'm going to have to say no to that money. And then there was the pathway of the world, and that was to say, look, you approach business as worldly as you want, to make as much money as you want, put no rules on it. And guess what? Those people usually end up making more money and a lot faster, but they end up becoming morally degenerate. So that's the kind of stories that were in competition with one another in the 1800s. And in the 1800s, you had saloons popping up all over the place, which had prostitutes in them, and so there was, and the cities had all these problems of industrialization and treating people like, factory slaves, a lot of competition themes and dehumanization of your fellow man, and so a lot of things to be concerned about here, but the old Puritan vision of going back to the farm and keeping the family safe from those oppressive influences out there in the world and maintaining the biblical vision of honest hard work was the goal of the Christian novelists. And I have to say, as a Christian myself and as a biblical economist, that would be the group I would be siding with. God bless you out there. This is John with WesleyGospel.com.